It's the city where East meets West. On Ferhadija Street in the heart of Sarajevo, the grand Austro-Hungarian architecture of Christian Europe suddenly gives way to the low roofs and the timber frames of the Muslim Ottoman Empire. For centuries, this was the multicultural epicenter of Europe, a city where Catholics, Jews, Muslims, and Orthodox Christians all rubbed shoulders. But Sarajevo is something else too. It's the city where the ethnic tensions of the former Yugoslavia finally snapped, creating bloodshed on an unprecedented scale. For 1,425 days in the early 1990s, Bosnian Serb forces laid siege to Sarajevo. Shells pounded hospitals and marketplaces. Snipers murdered children in the streets. So, how did it come to this? How did a city famed for its melting pot of cultures become ground zero for a bloody ethnic conflict? Well, today we journey into the history of Sarajevo and examine how a beacon of tolerance became divided by hatred. In 1461, an Ottoman nobleman named Isobeg Ishakovits stood on a low plain in the heart of the Balkans, surrounded by forested mountains. At his feet, the remains of the Kingdom of Bosnia lay in ashes, devastated by the Ottoman army that was sweeping through the Balkans. The Bosnian city of Vrhbosna, built in this very place, it was no more. But Isobeg Ishakovits wasn't a destroyer. He was a builder, and it was here, on this plain, that he decided to build Sarajevo. Officially founded in 1461, the origins of Sarajevo's name are a mystery. Some sources claim that Ishakovits' second act after building a mosque was to build a housing area known as Saray, from where the city ultimately got its name. Others have pointed out that Saray was an Ottoman word for palace, while Avasi means field, so Sarajevo would literally be the field around the palace. Fun theories aside, though, the early city soon established itself as an important trading outpost on the Ottoman frontiers. By 1470, Ishakovits had built Kolobara Han, a grand wooden inn capable of housing thousands of travelers. And by the way, another cool fact here, that inn actually still exists. If you're in Sarajevo, it is totally possible to grab a coffee in a building as old as the city itself. Over the next 100 years, Ishakovits' new city had flourished. By the mid-16th century, his successors had built 100 mosques on this once empty plain. Not that Ottoman Sarajevo was a strictly Islamic city. As early as 1530, an Orthodox Church, known today simply as the Old Orthodox Church, was built near the mosque. Catholics, too, were a notable minority. They weren't the only ones. Back in 1492, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon had signed a colossally dickish treaty kicking all of the Jews out of Spain. Known as the Sephardic Jews, the exiles spread across North Africa and Europe. Around 1541, the first of them reached Sarajevo. Since we're lucky enough to live in a time of casual intolerance, you might be expecting to hear that the Sarajevans had problems with this sudden influx of newcomers. But you'd be wrong. Not only did the ruling Ottomans allow the Sephardi to build their own Jewish quarter in Sarajevo, a Muslim Turk even stumped up the cash for a synagogue. It was an arrangement that allowed the city's Jews to thrive. Come the 17th century, Sarajevo was actually known as Little Jerusalem. Not coincidentally, the 17th century is seen as Sarajevo's golden age. Muslims, Orthodox Christians, and Jews, they all lived side by side amid the city's wooden Ottoman architecture. But already there was darkness on the horizon. Before the end of the century, an almighty storm would come and just sweep everything away. Okay, so we do need to backtrack a little. Remember when we mentioned the Ottoman army sweeping through the Balkans back in 1461? Well, they didn't stop at the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire in the 15th century was an expansionist superpower. Their armies were second to none. By the time the Old Orthodox Church was being built in Sarajevo in 1530, those armies had come crashing into Central Europe. It was here that the Ottomans finally collided with the other superpower that would shape Sarajevo's history, and that's Austria. The wintry dominion of the Catholic Habsburgs, Imperial Austria was far from the heat and bustle of Sarajevo's markets as it's possible to imagine. In 1529, the Ottomans laid siege to Vienna, determined to bring it into the Muslim fold. Although they failed to breach the city, it didn't stop their expansionism. Ottoman armies captured swaths of neighboring Hungary. In 1683, they laid siege to Vienna again. This time, though, the Habsburgs, they were ready. Thanks to one of those complex arrangements that were such a feature of pre-modern Rome, royalty, the Habsburgs weren't just rulers of Austria, they were also emperors of the gigantic Holy Roman Empire. And that meant they could call on one heck of an army to fight back the invaders. By October 1697, that one heck of an army had driven the Ottomans back to Bosnia. The Habsburgs marched into Sarajevo, torched everything, then marched back out again, taking most of their fellow Catholics with them. The fire that raged burned Sarajevo to ashes. But this was just the start of a series of catastrophes that would befall the city. The next 100-odd years in Sarajevo can be summed up in 3 terrifying words: fire, plague, death. It wasn't until the 19th century that the city finally re-emerged as its old, tolerant self. Unfortunately, no sooner had things stabilized than the rest of the Balkans decided to explode. The 19th century started with 2 major revolutions against Ottoman rule, one in Serbia and one in Greece. This kick-started 2 very important strands of Balkan thought. One was a kind of romantic nationalism, which for Serbs meant uniting all of the South Slav peoples into a single nation. That included the population of Sarajevo, whether they worshipped God, Allah, or Jehovah. The second was a new determination to kick the Ottomans out of the Balkans entirely. In 1877, that second point got a shot in the arm from the Russo-Turkish War. Pitting, as the name might suggest, the might of Imperial Russia against the Ottoman Empire, the war was nominally about Russia supporting its oppressed Slavic brothers in the Balkans and actually about Russia nabbing some prime real estate on the Black Sea. Nonetheless, Russia's resounding victory still managed to dislodge the Ottomans from Bosnia. Jubilant Serbs assumed that this meant they could now get on with their whole uniting the South Slavs plan. But, well, they were in for a disappointment. In an unexpected move, the post-war conference instead threw permission to occupy Bosnia to the Ottoman Empire's old enemy, the Habsburgs. On July 29, 1878, the Austrian successor state, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, marched into Bosnia. By August 18th, they'd reached Sarajevo. When local Ottoman loyalists tried to resist, the army shelled the city. Finally, on August 19th, they captured it. That same day, Ottoman rule ended in Sarajevo. A new era began for the city, one that would eventually see Sarajevo become the spark for one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. For Bosnian Serbs in Sarajevo, the appearance of the Catholic Habsburgs was a gigantic slap in the face. Having seen their fellow Serbs in Serbia proper throw off Ottoman rule and found an independent state, they'd kind of been hoping to join them. So the replacement of Ottoman rule with Austrian rule in 1878 was sort of like the great powers lining up one by one to kick every single Bosnian Serb right in the genitals. Not that Sarajevo was officially under Austrian rule, though. Technically, Bosnia remains part of the Ottoman Empire, even if in reality the Austro-Hungarians were calling the shots. And the Austro-Hungarians, they were desperate to buy their new subjects' loyalty. In Sarajevo, the Habsburgs went on a building spree, pouring lots of money into the crumbling city. Sarajevo got the first tram system in the whole of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It got electricity before Vienna. Half the buildings got a facelift, bringing them into line with Austrian architectural styles. If all that sounds pretty benign, you should know that it was actually kind of cynical. The conservative Habsburgs were extremely wary of newfangled technology like electricity. If it all went spectacularly wrong, they wanted Sarajevo to suffer the consequences, not Vienna. Still, life in Sarajevo, it generally improved. The city's Jews were granted new freedoms under the Austrians. Islam became an official religion of the empire. Sarajevo's Catholics, they got a new cathedral. By 1908, things were going so well that the Habsburgs decided to formally annex Bosnia. And just like that, well, the manure, it went crashing into the fan. The crux of 1908's Bosnian crisis was that Serbia had been waiting for the Ottoman Empire's now inevitable collapse with the hopes of taking Bosnia for themselves. When the Habsburgs instead annexed it, pan-Slavic feeling ran so high that Serbia nearly got Russia to attack Austria on their behalf. It was only when Germany threatened to attack Russia in retaliation that Russia finally backed down, leaving Serbia isolated and humiliated. If there's one thing you don't want to do as an empire at the turn of the 20th century, well, it's humiliate Serbia. June the 28th is a serious day for Serb nationalists. It's the date that the Ottoman Empire defeated Serb forces at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a foundational myth sometimes described as the Serbian Alamo. Unfortunately for history, it was also the anniversary of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's wedding. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, had married Duchess Sophie in 1899 at the objections of his family. The trouble was, Sophie was from a lower social rank. So disgusting did the conservative Habsburgs find this that Sophie was forbidden from taking part in any displays of royal pomp. However, a minor loophole existed for unofficial visits to various parts of the empire, visits without the usual Habsburg pageantry or security. And so it was that on June 28, 1914, a day of violent importance to nationalist Serbs, Franz Ferdinand, part of a family hated by those same Serbs, decided to treat his wife to an unofficial visit to Sarajevo, a city crawling with angry Bosnian Serbs. Not exactly hard to see how that could go wrong, is it? Now, unofficial didn't mean the couple just stepped off the train unannounced. There were still notices in the newspapers, still a police convoy that was laid on. But there was nothing like the security that had accompanied Emperor Franz Joseph's visit to Sarajevo in 1910. To throw out an analogy, this was kind of like JFK deciding to ride around Dallas in an open-topped car. And, well, 1914's version of Lee Harvey Oswald was already waiting. As the royal couple arrived in Sarajevo that fateful day, members of the Serbian Black Hands group had already taken up their position along the motorcade route. Armed with guns and explosives, the assassins were the suicide bombers of their day, ready to unleash chaos. But even these extremists, they couldn't have imagined just how many people they would ultimately kill. As the motorcade passed along the river, Nedeljko Kabranović hurled 2 grenades at the car that was carrying Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. Luckily, they both missed, blowing up the car directly behind the royal couple. Less luckily, the Austrian heir refused to believe that the attack meant he was unsafe in Sarajevo. In one of history's biggest what the moments, Franz Ferdinand made his driver stop after they reached Sarajevo's Austrian-built city hall. There, he made the fateful decision to visit those wounded in the attack in hospital. Ignoring the pleas of everyone to just run, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie turned their car around and drove straight back up beside the river to the scene of the attack. There, by the Ottoman Latin Bridge, a Black Hands member called Gavrilo Princip was loitering, depressed that the assassination had failed. What he felt when he saw the Austrian Archduke driving back towards him, a ridiculous ostrich feather flapping in his cap, is something we will never know. All we do know is that Princip did not hesitate. As the car approached, he stepped out into the street, he raised his gun, and he fired the shot that was heard around the world. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie on that Sarajevo street, it changed history. Thanks to a complex web of alliances, Austria-Hungary's subsequent invasion of Serbia dragged in all the other European great powers as well, and, well, you know the rest of this story. World War I claimed about 20 million lives. When the dust settled in November of 1918, the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires had all come crashing down. No sooner had the defeated Austrians left Sarajevo than the city's government declared Bosnia part of the new Kingdom of Yugoslavia, at that stage known as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Finally, the nationalist dream had been realized. Sarajevo was now part of a united South Slav nation. So, from this point on, all good news, right? To say that cracks soon appeared in this new united nation is to severely underestimate just how quickly everything fell apart. Since we don't have time for all the ins and outs, not unless you want this video to be 27 hours long and end with me dying of dehydration, the SparkNotes version is that the Serbs and Croats almost immediately fell out over everything and tried to settle their differences by assassination. In Sarajevo, all this violence, it generally passed people by, mainly thanks to Sarajevo being downgraded by Belgrade to the Yugoslav equivalent of Nebraska. But even becoming a provincial backwater couldn't keep these divisions out of the city forever. It started on April 6, 1941, when the Axis launched a surprise attack on Yugoslavia. By April 15th, fascist troops were marching into Sarajevo. Under the Nazis' watchful eye, Sarajevo was incorporated into a new Croatian puppet state ruled by a group called the Ustaše. Hardcore Croatian fascists, the Ustaše were more than willing to get into bed with the Nazis if it meant getting their own state without the hated Serbs. To that end, they opened concentration camps where they murdered Serbs by the thousands. In Sarajevo, though, they had other targets. Remember how Sarajevo had earned the nickname Little Jerusalem? By World War II's end, this would seem like an ugly and depressing joke. Before 1941 was out, Sarajevan Jews were being deported. In no time at all, 85% of the city's Jewish population had been wiped out. and it would never recover. Across the rest of fascist Croatia, massacres piled upon massacres. Ustaše troops tortured and raped, while Serbian partisans known as Chetniks murdered Croats in turn, and Bosniak Muslims were caught in the crossfire. Yet even now, Sarajevo held together remarkably well. The city has long had a tradition of citizens identifying as Sarajevan first and everything else second. In World War II, this allowed Sarajevo to become a hotbed of resistance activity. It was in Sarajevo that the partisan hero Vladimir Walter Perić ran his base of operations, carrying out daring sabotage attacks before disappearing like some World War II superhero. So damaging were Walter's attacks that the Croatian fascist commander of Sarajevo, Vjekoslav Max Ljubarić, had 323 civilians hanged to try to discourage him. But it wasn't enough. On April 5, 1945, the whole city rose up against the fascist attacks in a swell of resistance directed by Walter. Within 24 hours, the city had been liberated. One of the last casualties was Walter himself, who died from a grenade wound in the final minutes of the fighting. To this day, a monument stands to him in central Sarajevo. That November, the old Yugoslavia was reconstituted, this time as a socialist republic under dictator Josip Broz Tito. Although the massacres carried out by the Ustaše and Chetniks were still raw, Tito clamped down hard on any politics of grievance. Part Slovene, part Croat, and married to a Serb, Tito embodied more than anyone the promise of a united South Slav federation. He also knew how to treat those who threatened that promise. Former Ustaše supporters were executed. Meanwhile, Sarajevo, site of South Slav cooperation in the face of the fascist threat, was rewarded with investment. For the rest of Tito's long rule, Sarajevo would no longer be a backwater. It was elevated to capital of the new Bosnian Federal Republic. Jobs appeared, money, the population boomed. But we told you way back in the introduction that Sarajevo is famous today for enduring the longest military siege in modern history. Even as Tito focused on rebuilding his shattered corner of the Balkans, all he was really doing was papering over the deep cracks that World War II had exposed. It wouldn't be too long before those cracks split Sarajevo apart. In 2017, Balkan Insight ran an article featuring Sarajevans reminiscing about Tito's rule. Their tales were filled with recollections of partying through Friday night in multi-ethnic groups, then catching the first train to Croatia's coast town to swim together hungover in the Adriatic before returning to Sarajevo on Sunday, singing as they went. It sounds like a paradise. That may be partly nostalgia talking, but there's no doubt that under communism, Sarajevo may have experienced its second golden age. The high point came in 1984 when the city hosted the Winter Olympics. But even then, dark forces were already working to tear the united South Slavs apart. The catalyst came on May 4, 1980, when Tito passed away in Ljubljana, in Slovenia. Following his death, 6 Yugoslav republics, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Slovenia, and Macedonia, were all granted autonomy. This led to a resurgence of nationalism. In 1987, for example, minority Serbs in the autonomous province of Kosovo rioted against perceived injustices from the Albanian majority. A rising Serbian politician named Slobodan Milošević realized that he could boost his career by fanning the flames of these grievances. He began making speeches warning that Serbs would take up arms against their countrymen. Not long after, Milošević became president of Serbia. One of his first acts was to annex Kosovo, ending its status as an autonomous province. For those in Sarajevo, these rumblings must have seemed ominous, but also detached from their daily lives. Yes, things were getting ugly in politics, but what did they have to fear in their multicultural city? The next year, 1990, free elections returned non-communist nationalist governments in all 6 of Yugoslavia's republics. Although some of them would make a half-hearted attempt to keep Yugoslavia together, the writing was already on the wall. On June 25, 1991, Slovenia and Croatia simultaneously declared independence. In Slovenia, this meant a quick 10-day dust-up that killed under 100 people. In Croatia, under the government of nationalist Franjo Tudjman, this meant a brutal war that would last 4 years and kill 20,000 people. It also saw Serbs living in Croatia try to carve out their own ethnically pure mini-state, lest a new Ustaše under Tudjman do to them what the real Ustaše did to their grandparents. As Slovenia and Macedonia split away and Croatia burned, Sarajevo remained mostly quiet. But it was merely the calm before the storm. In October 1991, the Bosnian parliament in Sarajevo began shuddering towards independence. That same month, a Bosnian Serb called Radovan Karadzic made a speech hinting at the annihilation of all Muslims should Bosnia secede. At that time, Sarajevo was over 50% Muslim. No one really believed that Karadzic could be talking literally. I mean, surely it was just a metaphor designed to show the depth of his feeling. On March 1st, 1992, Bosnia voted to secede from Yugoslavia in a referendum boycotted by Bosnian Serbs. Within days, violence was flaring across the nation as nationalist leaders and media fanned the flames of hatred. Inside their propaganda bubbles, Serbs only heard the vilest things about Bosniaks and Croats, and vice versa. In that poisoned atmosphere, it was perhaps no surprise that armed Serbs might try and storm the parliament building, or that a Bosniak Muslim gangster might shoot up a Serb wedding. On April 5, 1992, Sarajevo's innocence finally ended. A multi-ethnic crowd marching for peace was fired upon by Serb snipers. The next day, Bosnian Serb paramilitaries began shelling Sarajevo. Within days, Serb army regulars had arrived with new men and weapons. By May 2, 1992, barely a month after the fighting started, Bosnian Serb units had completely surrounded Sarajevo. From the forested mountains that Izetbegović Išaković had once looked down at his new city from in 1461, snipers and artillery rained death on a population that were trapped like rats in a cage. It was the start of the longest siege in modern history, and it was the final end of multicultural Sarajevo. The siege of Sarajevo lasted 1,425 days, from the spring of 1992 to the beginning of 1996. For most of that time, the Bosnian capital was completely cut off from the outside world. There was no running water, no electricity, no food, no medical supplies, no anything. Under the direction of Radovan Karadzic, the besieging Serb forces sent the citizens of Sarajevo back to the Stone Age. Muslim Bosniaks, Bosnian Croats, and moderate Bosnian Serbs alike were trapped within Sarajevo's confines. All of them suffered in ways the rest of us can't even begin to imagine. Shells landed day and night, hitting houses, hospitals, schools, marketplaces. Snipers indiscriminately shot anyone who ventured onto the city's streets. Pensioners, pregnant women, and playing children were all gunned down. For those left in Sarajevo, the siege meant having to build your own stove out of cut-up tin cans. It also meant never knowing when death might come, when a mortar might explode beside a water pipe and eviscerate the neighbor who stood beside you. Still, even in this hell, there were quiet moments of hope. Perhaps the most striking was Vedran Smailović, the cellist of Sarajevo. A classically trained musician, Smailović would sit down in freshly bombed buildings and play Albioni's Adagio in G minor. It was as absurd as it sounds, yet it offered a modicum of hope to those who heard him. As suffering piled upon suffering in Sarajevo, the international community sat on its hands. They dithered as mortars destroyed classrooms mid-lesson, killing scores of children. They dithered as the lack of supplies crippled thousands with malnutrition. And they dithered as the death toll finally topped 10,000, with 1,000 of those being children. Finally, in 1995, one atrocity forced the international community's hand. On August the 28th, ordinary Sarajevans were shopping in Markel Marketplace when 5 mortar shells landed in the crowds. The effect was like 5 separate meat grinders had simultaneously been flicked on. 43 people were obliterated in an instant. When reports reached the West, leaders finally decided to act. 2 days later, NATO jets started bombing Serb positions around Sarajevo. The new air support coincided with a huge Croatian military offensive. After a mini-war between themselves, the Croats and the Bosniaks had finally teamed up and turned their combined firepower on the Serbs. By October 1995, the dual offensive had broken the siege lines around Sarajevo. Although shelling continued, supplies began to trickle back in. Electricity was partially restored. On November 21, 1995, at a conference in Dayton, Ohio, all sides in the war agreed to a peace agreement ending the fighting. Bosnia was divided largely along ethnic lines, with Bosniaks and Croats in one part and Serbs in another. Sarajevo, too, was partitioned, with East Sarajevo drawn inside the Serb-dominated region. Finally, on February 29, 1996, the last Serb units left the mountainsides above Sarajevo. The siege was lifted, and below them, the shattered city lay in ruins. In the aftermath, Sarajevo lost what was left of its multicultural character. One by one, the Serbs and Croats left. By the time of the last Bosnian census in 2013, Bosniak Muslims made up 75% of the population in all of Sarajevo's districts. The one exception lay in Serbian East Sarajevo, which was 96% Serb. Reconstruction after the war, it came slowly, when it came at all. While you won't see any burnt-out buildings in Sarajevo today, you can still see bullet holes alongside subtle signs of continued ethnic division. Yet, even in divided Sarajevo, there is hope. In April 2018, the city's famous cable car finally reopened a quarter-century after it was destroyed during the siege. For many Sarajevans, the reopening was a chance to look towards the future of their city instead of back at a painful past. Indeed, if you visit Sarajevo now, you'll be struck by how normal it is. There are international restaurants, Irish bars, tourist hordes, museums and cycle lanes, everything you might expect from a European capital. Sarajevo's history might be one of a city ravaged by war, assassinations, and ethnic strife, but it is also one of endless rebuilding in the face of adversity. Hopefully, the next chapter in the life of multi-ethnic Sarajevo will soon be written. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe when you are subscribing. Also, do hit that bell icon so you find out when we put out a new video. And as always, thank you for watching.